I'm convinced that there is a meaning to life and that our presence here has a purpose. My grandma had 12 children. Lo and behold, they had children. And do you know, except the ones that had a better education and left Poland, all the rest are gone.
My mother was very attached to her big family. This is Grandma Fimetta. This is my mom. That's her oldest sister, whom I knew very well, with husband. This family survived. The others were exterminated.
They were rounded up in a football field, and then they were sent to concentration camps. So my relatives, that they must have been maybe at least 40 or more, they all were gone. No trace of them. My name is Nadja Marino. My birth name is Nadja Hammerman. Born the 25th of February, 1912 in Krakow, Poland. My mother's name was Esther Waxman. My father's name was Baruch Hammerman. He was a scholar of the Talmud. I have 3 sisters. The oldest one was Rosa. My second older sister was Jean. And my younger sister is Helen, and she's the only one that's still alive.
I was born in Vienna, September 2nd, 1918. My mother took me often to visit Grandma. Her name was Flimetta. And I loved going there to that small town in Poland.
My grandmother lived in that little town, salt mining town, Wieliczka, which is about half an hour from Krakow. And she had a store, and my mother used to call it the Macy's. It was a tiny little store, but Mother compared it to, because it was basically like a department store. It had shoes and the outfits for the salt mine workers and for the Sunday clothes for the peasants.
She sold clothing and I think tools, maybe farm things, lots of different things in that store.
Life as the family knew it would soon change. The following winter, the Great War would begin and Krakow would be evacuated.
There was the danger that my father would be taken into the army, and that meant, for a Jew, that meant either being killed because they put him in the front line as cannon fodder, or he was killed by his Christian colleagues, fellow soldiers.
Avoiding conscription into the army, Baruch moved his family to Austria.
When I was a year and a half, my parents emigrated to Vienna. My father, who did not pursue his career as a rabbi, became a merchant. As my father made more money, he moved from a lesser place to a better place. At one point we were so poor, we lit candles, and then we graduated and had oil lamps. And then finally we had gas lamps, and then the electricity came on because I go that far back.
It was almost an idyllic life in Vienna for Nadja and her sisters. A fine education enriched by music and art was provided them. Their father's thriving business kept he and his wife absent from parenting duties, so the young girls were left to their own devices. Vienna provided a world of culture and experiences.
We all had wet nurses because my mother couldn't nourish me. And mine was a Polish peasant woman by the name of Juliczka. She was basically closer to me than my mother. The woman on the left, by the name of Meta von Zorn, became our governess and had a very bad influence on my older sister. Rose colored her hair, which at that time was absolutely a no-no, and she became blonde, and she had her own friends that we didn't know. She didn't associate with any of us. She later had an illegitimate child.
To protect the family's honor and to preserve his daughter's reputation, Baruch adopted Heinz, giving him the family name Hammerman. Jean married Kurt Seinfeld and devoted much of her time to the family business.
With Jean, I was very close because she was a little bit like a mother substitute. My mother had so little time for us, being in business all day long. And Jean was very easy for me to relate to, and could too. So I was hanging around that couple a lot. What I remember about Nadja is that she was, to me, very glamorous, and she always had boyfriends.
My boyfriend, Ladislaus Rakosz, was originally from Hungary, and he was in the spice business, paprika, of course. He was also teaching me how to be a skier and a mountain climber. He was a good sportsman. He was at one point first team in Hungary of water polo.
And before Laci, the very serious boyfriend, who was Hungarian, she had another Hungarian boyfriend. His name was Desher, and he had a motorcycle and would come around and pick her up. And I thought it was so glamorous to be driving off on the back of a motorcycle.
Nadja learned to enjoy and become proficient in many sports that were reserved mostly for men, from skiing and mountain climbing to sailing and fast cars. This well-rounded sports education was taught by her first two boyfriends, Desher and then later Ladislaus Rakosz.
My father was very generous, and he allowed me to, at that time he had the money, to go to art schools. I went to the Frauenakademie, that was for women only, and then in my free time I went to the much better known Kunstgewerbeschule in Vienna.
Nadja, at the age of 16, embarked on a professional career illustrating for a company in Vaduz, Liechtenstein. After associating with friend and fellow artist Andreas Rosenberg, her career began to flourish.
I owe very much to a man by the name of Dr. Andreas Rosenberg. He was a wonderful teacher. He was probably the most gifted person I ever met. And Andreas got, through a place called Lens Studio, a contract to do a Italian fashion magazine. And he invited me to help him. And that's how I learned how to draw, with Andreas.
Seeking professional independence, she moved to the fashion mecca, Paris, where she continued her art education and began illustrating for the fashion industry in Switzerland.
I had established contacts with Switzerland. I did fashion illustration for a Swiss publication, and I'm forever a learner. And I enrolled in the L'École de la Grande Chaumière.
I think that this idea of drawing fashion and drawing as a way of making a living that came to me from Nadja, who did that very early on. I was very, very in her shadow, influenced by the things that she was doing. I was exposed to people making art, people loving art, art in the house. I had a very good life. I had lots of friends. I was always going out. I had lots of freedom. My parents were totally tied down into business and let us bring ourselves up. Then I somehow ended up in a design school. And in that high school is where I met my first Nazis. It was still illegal. It was before the Anschluss. And there were two guys, and I remember they would go to their locker, and I could see that they had Nazi uniforms in the locker. And they couldn't wear them, it was not allowed, but they kept them probably for secret meetings that they went to. Then, when I was 14, we moved. Now we had a very grand apartment with a big balcony out onto Maria Hilferstrasse. And my father probably did very well in business, and we could afford this grand apartment. There we had a cook. Actually, we always had a cook, even in our modest times, because it was just affordable, I think, in those times. But this cook in Maria Hilferstrasse is significant because she changed her politics from one evening to the next morning. She was a devout Catholic, and when she first heard about the Anschluss, that the Nazis were coming, she cried and carried on about how terrible that was. And then, one day later, she had been to a meeting, and she had become a Nazi overnight.
In 1937, I left Paris to visit with my family for the holiday, for Christmas and Hanukkah. I had left my green card, my carte d'identité, which permits me in France to travel, to work. The renewal came automatically. You put it in the post office, and a week or so later you could pick it up. But I at that point had left to go to Vienna, and my card had expired. I only wanted to stay for a week, and my family always said stay, and that's when I was stuck.
The expiration of Nadja's travel card while she visited her family, and a sense that Austrian annexation by Germany was close at hand, left Nadja with no choice but to remain with her family in Vienna.
On New Year's Eve, 1937, we had a party. We danced and we had champagne, I think, but it was already very much in the air that bad times were coming.
And there were postcards of Hitler in certain stores in the windows, and we used to pass by and make fun of it, because Hitler with his mustache looked like a caricature. We didn't realize we were totally uninformed of the danger. We were dancing on a volcano.
Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg met with Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden in an effort to defend his country's sovereignty. There he was humiliated by the Fuhrer and given an ultimatum.
Schuschnigg went to Berchtesgaden to speak to Hitler, and Hitler put him down in such a way that he broke down in tears, and he came home a broken man. But for us, Schuschnigg was still a symbol for freedom in comparison to Hitler.
Hitler entered Vienna amid cheering crowds lining the streets, a country in awe of overwhelming force and destructive power.
When the Hitler came, I got a phone call from Andreas, and he said, "Nadja, I'm leaving tomorrow. This is my goodbye to you." Because he had drawn a portrait of Schuschnigg on the sidewalk all over Vienna. And it had a slogan, like, Lang lebe. And he called me and said, I'm going to join the Foreign Legion because my life isn't safe. They will discover who did those portraits. So that's the last I ever heard of Andreas.
The day of the Anschluss, huge troops of military walked down our street, the Maria-Hilfer-Straße, a big white street, and past our building. And we were looking at it from our balcony. There were Nazi flags all along, as far as the eye could see, with swastikas, and we didn't have one, of course. It seemed like endless rows of soldiers, troops, vehicles, very frightening, and very loud music, of course, military music.
I remember waking up in the morning with noises that were like a crowd. And I thought, first of all, that I was back at my grandmother's house, and it was, they had a fair where they sold all sorts of things. And the murmur of all those voices was so familiar to me. And when I realized it was the people bunched together in front of our apartment, waiting for Hitler to come, in their best dresses, the children with flowers, and here comes Hitler in an open car, very slow, and he raises his arm like an automaton, and that's what I remember of Hitler. And I wanted to throw a bomb, but I didn't have any bomb ready.
I think that watching this was like knowing what's in store for you. And although we didn't know too much, and certainly not any details about their plan to eliminate all Jews, were details about camps and gas chambers. We didn't really know that. But we had such an overwhelming sense of bad things happening, and a regime that was totally dangerous and vile and malicious.
It's like that an abyss opens up before your steps. There's no more foothold. The world has changed from one moment to another. My father was arrested 3 days after Hitler came, under the pretext that he had insulted Hitler. And it was a made-up story by a man that owed my father money, and his assistant, a young girl, was the one that made that accusation, and that landed my father in prison. They put 2 men in my father's office. One was in uniform and one was probably an accountant, and they took over the business. To get my father out was, of course, a priority. So we had a family council, and each had a role to play. One of my sisters was in charge of exits, where they could go. The other one was what was left in our apartment to keep that going. And I was the one that was elected to get my father out. So every Thursday, they selected people to send to Auschwitz or to some of the other places. And I went on Friday to the police station. There was a little entrance with like a garden with a gate. And I went to the gate, you could look through, and I watched who was coming out, and I saw my father coming out. He was an elegant man, and here I see him with an open shirt and dirty, carrying a bucket with whatever through that garden. And it hurt me, but on the other hand, I was happy we were still there.
A clandestine underground of the Austrian resistance was formed. Code names for Hitler and the Gestapo were soon utilized.
I was told that there was a man who was in the close group of around Hitler, but had been disenchanted and had left. And he was helping Jews to get out. I got in touch with him over the phone and made an arrangement to meet him so that we could discuss how I could get my father out. I remember getting all dressed up for that rendezvous, which was taking place in a coffee house. So I was sitting there at the end of that long coffee shop and watching the door, and in walks a man, and I immediately know it was that man. Very tall, all dressed in black, and he had a black patch in one eye.
He was an imposing man. Lacking formality, he sat down at her table. She recounted the story of how the police had taken her father away. He told her that the police were under the jurisdiction of the SS, headquartered at the Hotel Metropole, and that Himmler, Reichsfuhrer, was in charge. Money was exchanged, and he gave her the name of a contact at the hotel who could get her father released.
He became interested in my story, and I remember at the end of our rendezvous, he asked me whether I would come with him to a meeting.
Willing to tell what she knew about her father's arrest, persecution, and other witnessed events, Nadja agreed and was escorted to a waiting car.
And I remember that we were in the back of the car, somebody was driving us, and he put a bandage over my eyes. He didn't want me to know where we were going. And at one point we stopped, and we went up some stairs and down some stairs, up some stairs. When I finally was allowed to take my bandage off my eyes, we were in a room with maybe 40 or more people. And they wanted to know what was going on, because they didn't know all the things that were happening among Jews. And so I was elected to talk about it. And it was exhilarating and frightening at the same time. But I spoke quite a while, and they asked me questions, which I answered the best I could. And that went on for a good hour or more.
Nadja testified to what she had seen and heard. People disappearing, her father's situation, the rumors of concentration camps, and Jews being taken from their homes and forced to scrub the streets of Andreas's portraits.
And then I was again bandaged and taken back to my house. The Gestapo had taken over the Hotel Metropole on the Donau Canal, and that hotel had become the headquarters for the Gestapo. When I came to the hotel, I saw two lines of people lined up. One was a short line, and those were the Christians, because they had also arrested Christians, as you know. And the long line was the Jews. And I looked at it, and I felt, if I am the last one, by the time I get in, I'll be totally demoralized. So, you know the word chutzpah, which means probably extreme courage. So I took my chutzpah in my heart, and instead of being the last on the line, I went through the square and to the door, and in front was a glass, one of those turning glass doors. In front was a soldier with a bayonet. And I came to the door, and very arrogantly I said to him, "I'm seeing so-and-so," the name of that Gestapo person. And the soldier said, "Open the door," in I went. And that was my first established chutzpah.
Knowing that the release of their father meant survival for the family, At the age of 26, Nadja puts all fear aside and secures her father's release from the Gestapo.
I was totally concentrated, and feelings of any kind are excluded. Fear or doubt or whatever. I was just there to do the job, and that made it easier. And also I was a pretty girl. That helped. That probably helped a great deal.
During the early annexation of Austria, it was German policy to use forced immigration to remove the Jews. As a condition for release, Baruch agreed to leave Austria with his family.
He had signed all of his possessions away. He had to. His business, his assets, his accounts, and of course the apartment with everything in it, all we owned.
With time running out, the Hammerman family spent endless hours searching from consulate to consulate for a country that would accept them and a country they could afford.
Eventually, through Kurt, my brother-in-law, we heard about Trinidad, which was a British colony. You could enter by paying a huge tax.
Needing money for exit visas, Baruch decided to take matters into his own hands.
My father had to steal his own money from his office. I don't know how he did it, but enough so that they could leave for Trinidad, because that was the only place that accepted them for, I think it was $500 per person.
And finally, it was decided Jean and Kurt would go first, then my mother and I would follow. And my father had a fairly large business, so there were people that had accounts that they had not paid yet, and they would give him the money, and he would try to smuggle it out, because you were not allowed to take any money out of Germany.
It was a cold and rainy day in early April. The Hammerman family arrived at the West Bahnhof train station. Very little was said. Messages were conveyed with a glance. There was no need to draw attention. Goodbyes had already been exchanged before they left. The anxiety and fear of the unknown, a new country, was lessened by the reality of German guards that scrutinized every movement of the travelers waiting to depart.
When my mother and I went, we were stripped at the border, and all of our tubes were open, toothpaste and face cream to see if there was money inside, and orifices were examined to see if we had any money there, and it was quite harrowing, very frightening. My mother cried all the time. And she was still crying when we were over the border. And I said, look, they're cows. These are Dutch cows. They're not German cows anymore. And we were in Holland. There was a committee from a Jewish agency waiting for us. And they gave us some money. They gave us some housing. I don't remember anymore whether it was in their building or some hotel, because we had to wait for the ship, which was the Oranje Nassau, a Dutch ship, to take us to Trinidad. And when we finally were on that ship, I remember it so well, I wanted to make believe this had never happened. I just didn't want to think about it anymore, and just go on to a new life. My mother had a terrible time on the crossing. She was very anxious about the rest of the family. And so was I, because we didn't know yet what would happen to them, and really didn't find out for quite a while what had happened to Nadja, Rose, and Hans.
I had to make a decision. I wanted to go back to Paris because there's no need for a fashion illustrator in Trinidad. So I basically made the decision to separate at that point from my family.
Saying goodbye to his friends and finalizing his remaining meager assets, Baruch makes his way by train to Holland and then by ship to Trinidad, where he joined his family.
When we first arrived in Port of Spain, it was such a shock in a way. It was a tropical harbor, hot, smelly, full of people, all sorts of races that we had never seen, some black and some Indian, lots of Indians, and animals were hauling carts, were running around, pigs and chickens and dogs, and lots of activity, lots of turmoil and tropical heat, and we were not equipped for any of this. Our clothes were too hot. We were stunned by all this splendor, but it wasn't really splendor. It's a harbor, a typical busy, crazy harbor scene. And we thought, I guess all of us, how are we going to survive here? Because we had very little money, we didn't fit in, and it was a very hard time getting adjusted there, making enough for living to survive, really. We didn't have much. We had a place to live. The first dwelling was right next to the police station. Well, there was such crazy noise and drunkenness and fist fights and knife fights every night around that police station that we couldn't get any sleep at all. And we wanted to move, and eventually did. We found a lady, and she had been building a house but ran out of money. And she said we could live in her half-finished house that had a tarp, no roof, and had no wall board, but the rafters were up everywhere. The bathroom worked, but mostly you could see through all the rooms. You know, it was a half-finished house, and that's where we lived for quite a while, actually. And we didn't mind the half-finished house because the wood smelled very nice, fresh new wood, but there were so many bugs, and the bugs were terrible. We would sit at dinner, and a huge tarantula spider would come down in the middle of the table. And there were flying cockroaches this size, and of course mosquitoes. Not necessarily malaria mosquitoes, because most of us didn't get malaria, but got terribly sick with typhoid or typhus. My father was always sick. He had a very bad time with his health in Trinidad. So that was not so fun. And we all worked, and worked hard to make it.
With the Hammerman family safe in Trinidad, Rose and Heinz continued living in the country outside Vienna. Nadja, with her green card expired, was unable to return to Paris, and the situation in Vienna had become more volatile. Trying to maintain a normal life, Nadja and her boyfriend Ladislas Rakosh were invited to attend a party. That very evening, Berlin and Vienna would erupt into anti-Semitic violence. Jews were arrested and beaten, shops destroyed, and synagogues burned. It was to become known as Crystal Night.
We were invited to have dinner with friends. And I remember I boiled some eggs to bring along. A contribution to the dinner. And had it in a little basket. And we walk on the street and friends meet us and say, listen, they are stopping people on the street and you better be aware of it. And here, what I had done was, with the eggs, I had painted a portrait of Hitler. It was very easy. You know, I could still do it with the hair like this and the mustache, and that was in my basket. So I took it by hand and squashed it all. And that was my remembrance of Christine.
With danger surrounding her, Nadja takes a job teaching French and art to a wealthy family in England. Moving to England, however, came with conditions.
As a condition to enter England, the British required you to become a member of the Church of England. But people didn't know that that was happening in Vienna.
In order to obtain a visa to England, Nadja was required to renounce her Judaism and become a member of the Church of England. Saying the Lord's Prayer and swearing to the church was done without conviction.
And I said to myself, nothing changes, it's just a mumble, don't take that serious. So I mumbled and I had my permission to go to England. On the trip to England, you could have a 3-day stay in France. So I came to Paris on the way to London, and somehow, on a strange quirk, I went to that post office and gave them my information. 2 minutes later, she comes back with my carte d'identité, which meant that I didn't have to go to England. I could stay in Paris, where I had all those friends and connections and work. I was jubilant. I started, it was evening and it was deserted, and I started to dance all over the place with my cart.
Having been appointed by the Ministry of Chile to the position of Consul General at the embassy in Paris, General Armando Marin Mojica arrived with his wife and 2 sons to assume his duties.
My name is Luis Marin Olmo. My father's name, Armando Marin Mujica. My mother's name is Irma. I was born the 21st of February of 1925. I was about 13 or 14 years old. My father, he was Consul General in Paris. My mother, my brother, and myself. We were living at the Hotel Celtique, Rue Balzac, in Paris.
The invasion of Eastern Europe sent refugees fleeing their countries. Armando Marin immediately began his new office by raising money to help pay passage and issued visas for indigent people. The consent and standards for immigration were set by the Ministry of Chile. Types of occupations and personal wealth were the main criteria. Returning from Paris, Nadja is now able to send needed supplies to her family in Trinidad. She reestablished a career as an illustrator for Swiss papers and continued her studies at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière.
Well, when I lived in Paris, I made friends. Among them was a journalist, and he said, Nadja, I have bad news for you. Your sister has about 10 days to get out of Vienna. Then the curtain comes down of all the Jews, and there won't be any way that... So I was in tears and I was desperate. And he said, well, look, I'm going to try to help you. And he brought me the next time 3 recommendations of 2 South American countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And as I said, that I believe in pattern in life, ini mani mo, I choose Chile. And the Consul General was newly appointed by his nephew, who had a high position in politics. I was the last one that was admitted in his very elegant, beautiful office. And when I told him the story, tears came to his eyes. And he hadn't known anything about persecution. And he said to me, I will help you. And then he said, but I want something from you. And at that point, I was willing, and I expected anything to save my sister's life. And so he said, what is it you want? And he said, I want a kiss. And so then we both stood up and approached each other. And I don't know whether he embraced me or not, but the next thing I know, that when the kiss happened, the next thing was he fainted, and I saw him lying on the floor in front of me. And in moments like this, I have sang-froid. That means cold blood. Translated means I'm practical. And I immediately ran to the bathroom to wet a towel and tried to revive him. When I came back, he was already up and about. And he did get my sister out before the 10 days were over. And I had an artist studio, and this is where I put her and her son. So they had a place to stay. He invited me to the theater, I remember. And as a poor student, I had nothing to wear. And I borrowed, I think, a boa from a friend of mine to just be dressed more elegantly than a student. And I went to the theater with him, and then it developed into a relationship.
War brought Nadja and Armando closer. They sought comfort and retreat in their new secretive relationship. To keep her close, Armando gave Nadja a job in the embassy as an interpreter. With refugees pouring into Paris, Armando responded by loosening ministerial rules and sent requests for exit visas for people with less than 300 francs or $6 US. Realizing that Rose and Heinz would not be able to leave Paris without help, Nadja goes to Armando. With Nadja's request, he sends them to Chile. Seizing the opportunity to escape from the stress of duty, Armando accepts an invitation.
He invited me to a maiden voyage of the Pasteur, which was a newly built French ship that was supposed to do the crossing between Calais and Dover. And on that voyage, Armando took me, and I was Mrs. Marino. And when we came to the White Cliffs of Dover, the first German airplanes flew over. That was the beginning of the World War. And we turned around and went back. So it was an uncompleted trip, but an interesting one, because I also consummated our relationship on the ship. And it was very strange, because at one point Armando turned to me with tears, and I said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because I will never have a child with you." So the more I think about his personality, the more of a mystery he is really to me.
In late September, Nadja received a message from Ladislas Rakosh informing her that he and his brother Charles had made it to Paris. Wanting to leave Europe, he asked Nadja for help. She arranged a meeting with Armando. Once again, because of her influence, Armando gives Ladislas a false profession suitable for immigration to Chile. A letter to the Ministry of Chile from Armando was written, requesting a visa permitting immigration for Ladislas and his brother Charles. This letter indicated that they were Jews of Hungarian nationality. Ladislas was given the profession of an important dentist holding patents, and his brother as an indispensable collaborator.
And he was in the spice business, paprika. Of course.
Not receiving a reply from the ministry, Armando made the decision to grant the visas and sent them without permission. In a letter of reprimand from the ministry, Armando was directed to abstain from granting visas without proper authorization. By the time this letter was received, Ladislas and Charles were already safe in Chile. In early spring of 1940, German troops invaded France.
Armando sent his wife and his 2 children back to Chile because the invasion happened. And so there was a reason that he put his wife back in safe territory with the 2 kids.
My father, he was consul in Paris, and he had been in the army. He was general, and he knew very well the German army. So he got us out of Paris and back to Chile as soon as possible. My father stayed in France. My mother came back with my brother and myself, the 2 of us, in the Copiapó Chilean boat, and we came straight back to Panama and to Valparaiso.
Armando's wife and sons arrived safely in Chile while Paris braced for imminent invasion.
We expected that Paris would be invaded, and at that point Armando didn't know whether the city would be peacefully occupied or not. So he gave me a gun. I think it was a Mauser. And we went to the Bois de Boulogne, the park, and I learned how to shoot. And I became a very good shot. We shot at champagne bottles. but I was very good, and I slept with the gun under my pillow.
In an effort to avoid the destruction of the capital, the government of France left Paris undefended as the German army rapidly approached.
The fear of German not being friendly with the Parisians, there was an exodus that happened. And from the window of the legation, I watched people leaving Paris on cars, on horse-drawn cars, on bicycles, on foot, with their belongings, and it went on for hours.
With German guns pounding in the distance and her fear of Nazi atrocities, Nadja realized it was too late for her to leave the city, and as a Jew, she could not stay. Her only choice was to become someone else.
There was a stove, and I put all my documents that would have shown my identity as a Jew, and I burned them all.
In order to save the life of his lover, Armando Marin gave her the name Juana Marino, a name purposefully similar to his own.
Armando gave me a Chilean visa, and I was born of Chilean parents of Catholic religion. And I also made myself 4 years younger on the passport.
Living among the very people who would take her life, Nadja, now using the alias Juana Marino, kept her protector close.
And then Armando moved in with me. I looked for an apartment. I moved out of my studio, which was not suited, and rented a very elegant apartment. And Armando lived in our apartment and not at the legation. And I think that people must have been aware of it because strange things happened. I remember I had a quarrel with him because he mentioned his wife, and I felt offended and probably voiced it. And he put the key of our apartment on the table and he walked out. And after he had left, I felt that I had done something very stupid, because the man that was my protection against the Nazis had walked out of my life. And so I was in a very bad mood. What can I tell you? afraid, to say the least. Well, what happened was that I think 2 days later I got a phone call from the Chilean embassy, and they asked me to come because after he left my apartment, our apartment, he walked and walked, and they found him walking on the street, half conscious. And so they put him in the embassy in his room, in bed. And when I got the phone call, they asked me to come because all he uttered was my name. And so, of course, I went, and I remember there was a room full of people, and when I came, everybody left. And he said, "Nadja," and embraced me, and then he was well again.
With food and supplies scarce in Paris, Armando and his chauffeur, Raymond, locate a nearby source.
There was hunger in Paris, and Raymond had an uncle who was a butcher in Gisors, outside of Gisors. And once a week, we traveled with Raymond, and his uncle had cut up meat for us to take back and to distribute.
Nadja continued her work as an interpreter in the embassy while Armando fulfilled his moral obligation to liberate as many refugees as possible. In 1941, the embassy staff was called back to Chile. The ever-vigilant protector, Armando, accompanied Nadja to New York.
After the 2 years that we spent together, the regime changed. The political regime in Chile changed, and he was called back. So, of course, I left too. It was the natural thing. Once he knew that he had to go back, he bought a car, and somebody that worked for him and his wife, the four of us traveled in the car. And I remember that we set off from Paris and went to Portugal. And then in Portugal, we took the Serpo Pinto, was the name of the ship.
After a perilous 2-week journey across the U-boat-infested Atlantic, they arrived safely in New York. Having settled into a hotel in Manhattan, Armando remained with Nadja for 3 days until the Serpo Pinto was ready for passage to Chile. Returning to his family in Chile, Armando closed the hotel door, leaving Nadja alone in her room. Alone in a country she knew nothing about, holding a picture of him and wondering if they would ever meet again. News of the war was an event eagerly awaited for the family that had escaped to Trinidad. This new and unusual lifestyle was taking its toll on the transplanted European family.
Because the war was going very badly for the Allies, they decided we were enemy aliens. I mean, they knew we weren't, but there might be spies disguised as Jewish refugees. And so the solution to that was that we were all interned in an internment camp. The camps were makeshift, leftover barracks from army exercises, very primitive. There was a kitchen and living quarters. That was certainly not a concentration camp, but it was not pleasant.
Finding work for the girls brought relief from the boredom of life in the internment camp. It also brought distance in Jean and Kurt's marriage.
There was a little hospital, a tiny clinic. Jean and I volunteered, and she became the camp nurse, and I became the dental assistant because there was a dentist with a full-blown practice in the camp. He had the chair, everything he needed. And he was also a medical doctor from Germany. And he and Jean fell madly in love and had an affair. Jean's marriage was practically over. She didn't really consider herself very much married anymore to Kurt. With Paul, it was a really big passion, and she became pregnant. And Kay was born in the camp. Everybody was very fond of her. She was the cutest baby. The gossip was rampant, of course, because people knew it wasn't Kurt's baby. Kurt made put a good face on it and pretended he was the father, I think he did, but he was very fond of the baby.
The docile life of the Hammerman family living in Port of Spain was about to have a radical change.
A gigantic change came over that island. It had been so backward, so sleepy, so primitive. Trinidad became a giant base, a major base in the Caribbean for American troops. And suddenly there was this influx and everything came to life, and they even let us out of the camp. Then Jean and I got paid jobs for the USO, and that was delightful because we were behind a counter and hundreds of servicemen would come and we would give out equipment for ping pong, for roller skating. We changed money, we gave sympathy and listened to their nostalgia, their missing their homes, the young guys who didn't know what to do with themselves. And we learned to dance, swing, and boogie-woogie. That's how I met my husband, Leonard, whom I later married. He was an officer in the U.S. Army on detached service to the Navy. We began to be boyfriend and girlfriend.
Receiving orders to return to the United States, Leonard was now in a position where he could sponsor Helen and her family to leave Trinidad to join him.
I had had so much of a bellyful of Trinidad. I was so tired of it. The tropical heat, the monsoons, everything moldy, and I just ached for getting away and getting to New York and studying again and becoming an artist and really having a real life. Nadja and Leonard met in New York, and their combined efforts finally got us to the United States.
With Kurt and Jean's marriage now a failure, Jean and her daughter Kay remain in Trinidad with Dr. Paul Labont. As Heinz's talent grew after years of dedication to the piano, Rose makes the decision to leave Santiago, Chile, and bring her son to New York.
Heinz was very young, maybe an adolescent, and came under the tutelage of Claudio Rao, the pianist, and Claudio Rao made him his protege, played on the radio, and later had a career as a concert pianist.
He had his debut at the Carnegie Hall and rave reviews.
Familiarity and the love of his family brought Armando back to the land that he loved and missed. With stress and duty left in a different world, Armando and his wife, Irma, soon welcomed another child into their family.
My name is Irma Marin. He's my brother, Luis. And we also have a brother, Armando, who died about 5 or 6 years ago. And we are the only sons and daughter of Armando Marin Mujica, my father. I was born after he came back he was a very sweet person with me. He was very loving with me. And I remember he had a gold condecoration that they gave him when he was a general. And when I turned 15, he gave it to me. And that was something that I will always treasure. My mother, she was a beautiful woman. She was a very good mother. Present. She was always there for me.
My mother got married when she was very young. She was 16 when she got married. And then she got 3 kids.
He was a very family man. He was a family man. Yeah, I always saw my mother and my father as a very united couple. And he was very nice and very tender with my mother. That's the way I saw them.
With Armando now residing in Chile, Nadja summoned her courage and set out to discover a new life in a new land.
I came to New York in March of 41. I had $250 that Armando gave me. I didn't know any English. I was fluent in French, and my mother language is German. And I looked for a job. And I think 2 weeks later I had a job at the Apple Studio. And I did fashion illustration. But then I found a job in a department store with Stern Brothers.
Nadja illustrated for various department stores throughout the city. Always trying to improve her life, she developed an impressive portfolio which she brought to the New York Times.
The art director looked at my work and he said, excuse me, took my portfolio and went up to the executive on top, one of the executives. And what I heard later was that the executive said to the art director, he said, she draws like Toulouse-Lautrec. That was the best compliment I ever had in my whole life. And they hired me. And so I did for 5 years.
Nadja's professional career and social life in the city was soaring. With an impressive job as senior illustrator for the New York Times and a full social calendar, parties and events were frequent. At one such event, she met fellow artist Joseph Kalfel. He would later become her husband.
We walked out together, ended up in a Chinese restaurant, and I told him my whole story, including Armando. And he was a wonderful listener. At that time, my father had developed cancer, and Joe was the shoulder I could cry on. And so we became very good friends.
Within the year of their meeting, Nadja and Joseph would marry and have a son they named Jesse. Working as a fine art painter, Joseph did not produce a steady income. Nadja supplemented their incomes by doing freelance illustration for Vogue, Harper's, and Vanity Fair. She also illustrated for the most prestigious companies in the cosmetic industry.
I was freelancing for the cosmetic biggies, Revlon, Germaine Montet, who was the most elegant producer of cosmetics. Very expensive.
Wanting to improve her position as an artist, Nadja looked to Madison Avenue for help.
I got an agent by the name of David Bradshaw, who represented hundreds of artists. And one of the things that he sent me to was Seligman and Lutz. And they had about 5,000 stores, hairstyle. So I became a hairstyle illustrator. At one point, there was a promotion scheduled at Saks Fifth Avenue for a famous French hairdresser, Antoine de Paris. He called me from Paris and told me he was coming and he needed hairstyles. So when he came, we sat down and I think at one of the big hotels in the lobby, and I had my sketchbook with me. And he said, draw me new hairstyles. So among them, I did the beehive, which I have proofs, not the original, but I have proofs for it, because of course he signed his name under all those new hairstyles. I didn't get any credit, but it was okay, I made money. So then I became a hairstyle illustrator. That I went on for years. So that was my illustration for the New York Times, for the cosmetic field, and for hairstyles. I was very productive in those days.
In the years that would follow, Nadja and her family would see far less turmoil. Baruch, the patriarch of the family who survived Nazi tyranny, would succumb to cancer. His wife Esther, in her later years, would become a highly acclaimed primitive artist and hang in many museums. She would die at the age of 94. Rose, having never married but devoted her life to her son Heinz, would live long enough to see her son become an accomplished musician. Jean, the second oldest and nurturer of her sisters, would live in Trinidad until 1959, leaving only after her husband, Paul Labont, died of a heart attack. Her daughter Kay left Trinidad as a teenager and was educated in England. She now resides in New Jersey. Helen and Leonard married and moved to California and had 2 children. Their marriage would later end in divorce, leaving Helen a single mom to raise 2 daughters, Nanette and Michelle. Helen continued her art education and received a master's in fine arts degree. She taught for 27 years at the California College of Arts and was on the faculty at UC Berkeley. Helen later published a book of her life through etchings. She resides in Berkeley, California. For almost 2 decades, Armando's life was enriched by his family and his varied interests, from farming to the harvesting of timber in southern Chile. On the 23rd of October, Armando passed away, leaving behind his wife, Irma, his 2 sons, Armando and Luis, and his daughter, Irma, thus ending the last chapter in the life of a very distinguished military general, consul general, husband, and father. General Armando Marin Mujica will be remembered for his selfless commitment to duty, foregoing any personal gains and saving hundreds of Jews and Christians from possible death or persecution at the hands of the Nazi regime.
I don't think that you can call it a philosophy, but after the many years that I was gracefully given on this planet, I'm convinced that there is a meaning to life and that our presence here has a purpose. Can I be helped to believe in miracles? When I look at my life, that I survived is a miracle. How I got here was a miracle. How I succeeded is a miracle. Maybe we each have a message or something to achieve in our life here. I hope that people that will hear about me and see this project will go into their inner voices and establish what their purpose in life is.
Nadja was unaware for 70 years what had happened to Armando. War and time had misplaced memories and feelings. Never hearing from Armando again, Nadja believed with certainty that his life had been put in jeopardy, and he must have suffered grave consequences because of the visas and false identities he had created for her. This guilt that Juana Marino had felt for all these years was to be laid to rest with the truth of time.
When we met, it was like lightning. I think the French word for it is coup de foudre. It's becoming alive again. After so many years, I was just, you know, it's just a memory. And I have a photograph next to me. And at least once a day I thank him for saving my life. It's not upsetting, it's just emotionally like a turmoil in me right now. You know how many years that is now? It's 41. It's the last time I saw Armando. It's quite a few years.